So I think that's a very good application. Yeah, that's why I like his dissertation. So. OK. And in fact, that was like sort of the basis of your problem set, right? OK. So to focus on Spence type effects, I'm going to assume that only the number of people that purchase the product matters. So the identity of consumers is irrelevant, as in Jenskow and Shapiro. And the other effects are going to show up in a natural way. OK, so this is going to show the basic logic. And we'll generalize beyond that. But maybe in a telecommunications network, or there's some other networks where you can imagine that it's mostly the number of people you interact with that matters, rather than exactly who it is. OK. So users, like in the Spence model, are going to have a utility for joining, but it's now going to, rather than depending on some non-price characteristic that the firm chooses, it's going to depend on the number of people who buy the product, right? So now note that the number of people is going to both serve the role that the number of people served before, and it's going to serve the role that row served before, right? So how can we use that to determine what's the effect on the number of people who buy, on the price of the product from changing the number of people who buy it? Does anyone want to try to do that? Well, we get basically both of the effects we got before from changing the number of people. On the one hand, we know that when we increase the number of people, that's going to reduce the price by 1 over the number of marginal people. That's the p prime thing that we got before, right? But then we're also going to increase it by the average value of the marginal consumer for the product, right? So both of those effects now come in and show up when we change the number of people. So this is like the classical monopoly Cournot effect, but then also simultaneously comes in this average value of the marginal consumer effect, right? And so that means that prices may rise or fall as you increase the number of people. On the one hand, as you increase the number of people, you have to lower the price to get more people in. But on the other hand, the product becomes more valuable, right? If you looked at last year's problem set, there was a bunch of stuff I did with this about Next Restaurant, which I'm actually going to eat at tonight. Actually by creating more demand for their product, they may actually raise the price for it, potentially. OK. So for everything else, we're just going to combine the roles of rho and n, right? So now cost only depends on the number of people. The social value of the derivative of the social value is again going to be p minus marginal cost, which we had before for n. But then we also have this plus n times the average value to people who are participating of having one more person involved. The private value is p minus marginal surplus minus marginal cost plus n times the value to the marginal consumers, right? And so the socially optimal pricing is going to be just to give a discount off of marginal cost that's equal to the average externality that you bring to other consumers, right? That's just externalities like we had before. And the monopolist is going to distort relative to that in 2 different ways. Eric, do you know what they are?
Yeah, because he's moving away from... So he's changing the number of people that are using the platform, right?
Yeah.
So that's the one distortion. And then he's changing... It's not just the price, is it?
Yeah, so what's the distortion that we talked about in the last couple of classes? That was the first one you were talking about, right?
Yeah.
Which was like the Cournot distortion. It was like you have too few people because marginal revenue is below price, right? And what's the distortion we've been talking about today?
Well, he's changing the number of people in the network because the value of the network is dependent on the number of people. That's the second, right?
Yeah. So basically, there's both the Cournot distortion from this marginal surplus from the last 2 lectures, but then there's the Spence distortion as well, right? And so he he should subsidize based on the value it's brought to the average consumer, but instead he subsidizes based on the value that's brought only to the marginal consumers. And just as in Spence, this could go either way. So let's first think about the newspapers case. So I think in newspapers, the people who dislike advertisements the most are probably the people who enjoy reading the newspaper or are willing to pay the most for the newspaper, right? The people who are like inframarginal readers of the New York Times, maybe like some of us in this room, probably hate advertisements a lot more than people who are marginal readers of the New York Times, maybe in some rural area, right? On the other hand, and therefore, they might actually have too many advertisements, even though the Cournot distortion would say they'd want to distort downward the number of advertisements they have, right? Because the advertisers are their consumers, right? On the other hand, in credit cards, right, the people who most value using their credit cards are also the people who most value having another person accept their credit card, right? And therefore, they're likely to distort downward the number of people who accept the credit cards for two reasons, both because they're not taking into account the inframarginal consumers' greater value for having their credit card accepted, and they're not taking into account and they also have the standard Cournot distortion downward of the number of people who accept the card, right? But in some ways, I think the Spence distortion may be even more important here, because in the Spence case, often firms offer multiple products to discriminate to different consumers, whereas here, you don't usually offer multiple different sets of people who accept your credit card or not, right? It's usually just one. Okay. And it can exacerbate or be mitigated by the market power distortion. So in the advertiser's case, right, it's actually good that there's a Cournot distortion downward of the number of advertisers because it helps offset the harmful effects of not internalizing the information. But whereas in the credit card case, it exacerbates it and makes it worse. Okay. So in many, if not most of these cases we've been talking about, there are distinct different groups of consumers, which we could call sides of the market and label by A, B, C, et cetera, like readers and advertisers, card holders and card acceptors. And there's a bit more notation in deriving this, but the idea is basically the same. So, Carl, what would we expect to be the optimal pricing to one side of the market? Following sort of the same logic from before. Yeah. If there's a bunch of different sides that I could potentially bring externalities to.
Yeah, it would just be the social benefit or actually, not
Okay, that's fine. Does anyone else want to try to just extend the logic from before? Yeah, Chrissy.
So you just do per group pricing, where each group is like the marginal benefit minus average externality.
Yeah, other way around. They pay for the marginal cost minus
their benefit.
Yeah, exactly. So each firm has a price which is equal to marginal cost minus the sum over all the groups of the average marginal externality they bring to the people in those groups, conditional on being in the average set of people in those groups, right?
Is J one of the sides of the market, or is
J is one side of the market, yeah. Oh, it's varying. It's an index that's
right,
varying,
right,
yeah.
Right. J is one of the things in I.
Yeah, exactly. Oh no, this is I is not the set. I is like a representative element of this.
J is one, and then you're averaging across.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So then, how would the two private distortions to the optimum show up here, Kentaro? How would the distortions from profit maximization show up here?
So it should include the marginal effect of the expectation for each J.
You mean that this will be conditional on the marginal set of people on the other side, or?
Yeah. So you mean private optimum or social?
The profit maximizing optimum, the private optimum.
Okay, so it should basically deal with the distribution of J.
Yeah?
So how so the change in PI, how the monopolistic platform should deal with how the change in PI would affect the distribution of J in the set I.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're going to change this to being the set of marginal consumers
Yeah.
rather than average consumers. And we're going to have the standard Cournot markup term that's equal to the marginal surplus, right? So that's the two distortions. There's the Cournot distortion and the Spence distortion. The Spence distortion comes from the externalities that you bring to other people. Cournot distortion comes from the markup on people in this market. Okay. So now let's return to the concerns that I had before about the intensity of purchases, right? So like, for example, by changing the newspaper content, you might not just change how many people read the newspaper, but how carefully do they read the newspaper. And the more carefully they read the newspaper, the more valuable they'll be to advertisers, right? And so we could think of the cost that you have of serving someone, which might be a negative cost, right, in the case of the newspapers, as being a function not only of the not of the level of we could think of the cost of serving them as being a function of not just the quality, but of the utility that you bring those people. If you bring them more utility, they're less costly or more profitable to you because they read more, right? And so then your total cost is going to be the number of people you serve times the average cost of serving those people, right? So individuals with greater utility decrease your cost. This is the same as contributing to profits, right? Or you could think of it as a moral hazard dimension of the product usage. So then how your cost changes when you change the price is just the number of people on the margin times the average cost of someone who's on the margin, right? So you can that's the marginal cost. And how the cost changes when you change the non-price characteristic, given that all the marginal people have the same cost because they have the same utility level, right? Then this is going to be the number of marginal people times the product of their marginal utility from increasing rho a little bit times their cost plus the number of people who are participating times how much of an increase in cost you have to give comes from increasing on average their the non-price characteristic, plus there's a marginal utility that they get from changing the non-price characteristic, and that affects the cost of serving them, right? Now, this is just equal to the cost of anyone who's on the margin is just the marginal cost, because their cost depends only on their utility, and all the people on the margin have utility equal to price. So what we get is that the derivative holding fixed the number of people of the cost with respect to rho is going to be the number of people times the direct increase in cost, the expectation of the direct increase in cost, plus the average intensive margin benefit that we get from having them read the newspaper more or having a higher utility otherwise, right? Okay, so this replaces the C sub rho that we had from before. So we basically went inside of the cost function and we said, well, actually, our cost might be affected by how we affect the utility.